The wind carried dust and silence across the wide, open fields of Broken Horn Ranch. It was mid-afternoon, and the only sound was the creaking of a rusty gate as a battered blue truck rumbled up the gravel road. Inside, sitting on worn leather seats, Martha Caldwell held a clipboard and a rising sense of irritation. She'd ordered a strong, working quarter horse from a respected breeder in Texas. What she got, as the truck came to a stop and the trailer doors swung open, was something else entirely. Out stepped a tiny pinto pony, barely reaching Martha's hip. His black and white coat was clean but shaggy, and his legs looked more suited to a backyard petting zoo than a working ranch. Hank, her long-time ranch hand, let out a snort. "Hell, Martha, that's not a horse. That's a decoration." The driver, a man with sun-cracked hands and a guilty look, scratched his head. I think there was a mix-up in the paperwork. This little guy was meant for some therapy farm down south." Martha narrowed her eyes. "And you didn't check before driving 6 hours?" The driver shrugged. "Ma'am, he's here now." The pony stood still, unbothered by the conversation. His ears flicked at the voices, but he didn't flinch. His name, according to the tag on his halter, was Scout. He didn't prance. He didn't panic. He simply walked off the trailer and looked around like he already knew this land. The bigger horses in the nearby pasture all turned to stare. Dusty, the tall, dominant stallion, snorted loudly. The herd began to pace, their eyes locked on the small intruder. Martha sighed and waved her hand. "Put him in the side paddock until we figure this out." Scout trotted over, small hooves tapping on the gravel. The other horses lined the fence, looming above him like towers. They sniffed, sneered, and snorted. But Scout didn't back down. He stared straight ahead, ears up, chest out, not with arrogance, but with calm certainty. Like he'd faced bigger things before and survived them all. That night, Martha couldn't sleep. She sat by the kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching the silhouette of the little horse under the moonlight. Something about him stirred a memory. Her late husband, John, once said, "The ones who don't look like much are usually the ones who surprise you." Scout didn't look like much, but he carried himself like he knew something everyone else had forgotten. In the barn, Hank muttered under his breath while throwing hay. "Just what we needed. A house cat in horse's clothing." But as he turned away, Scout stood alone near the fence, still, steady, watching the herd, watching the land, as if waiting for something. And though no one could explain it yet, something had just changed at Broken Horn Ranch. By sunrise, the Broken Horn Ranch had returned to its quiet rhythm, but something in the air had shifted. The wind that morning felt cooler, carrying with it the smell of damp earth and old wood. Scout stood alone in the side paddock, head held high, his small body casting a long shadow in the morning light. Inside the pasture, the larger horses gathered at the fence, staring at him like he was a foreign language they didn't care to learn. Dusty, the herd's unchallenged leader, snorted and stomped, clearly agitated. The others mimicked him, tossing their heads and pacing the fence line. Scout didn't flinch. He didn't return the display. He simply stood still, ears rotating slowly like radar, eyes locked ahead. There was no fear in him, only focus. He didn't beg for acceptance. He didn't demand it either. It was as if he knew it would come, or that he could survive just fine if it didn't. Jake arrived that morning with a backpack slung over one shoulder and tired eyes from the long bus ride. The 12-year-old boy was quieter than most kids his age, shaped by a year of family silence after his parents' bitter divorce. When Martha met him at the gate, she pulled him into a one-armed hug. "You've grown," she whispered. Jake gave a small smile, but his eyes drifted past her, drawn to the small, unusual shape standing alone across the yard. "What is that?" he asked. "That," Martha replied, "is an accident, a mistake. But for now he's ours." Jake walked to the fence, stopping just short of the paddock. Scout turned his head slowly and stared at him. Not with fear. Not even curiosity. It felt more like recognition. Jake tilted his head slightly and stepped forward. They didn't touch. They didn't need to. In that moment, the boy and the pony shared something rare, understanding without explanation. Both of them had been dropped into places they hadn't chosen. Both of them had been told they didn't belong. And yet here they were, still standing. That afternoon, Hank threw feed into the trough and muttered, "We've got enough mouths to feed without keeping charity cases." But even he watched Scout from the corner of his eye, noticing how the little pony kept his distance without ever truly backing away. He didn't push, but he also didn't yield. He was just present, always watching, always waiting, like a sentry no one asked for, but maybe needed. As the sun began to set, Scout walked to the far edge of the paddock and stood facing the open field. Dusty stared back at him from across the fence. The standoff was quiet, unmoving. Martha, watching from her porch with a cup of tea in hand, whispered to no one in particular, "That little horse doesn't know his place." She paused, then corrected herself. "Or maybe he knows it better than the rest of us." The days rolled by with the steady rhythm only a ranch could offer. Fence mending, hay stacking, early mornings, and dusty boots. Scout remained in the side paddock, always watching, always waiting. He didn't whinny for attention or try to escape. Instead, he paced with purpose, memorizing the layout of the land, the habits of the herd, and the quiet mood swings of the people who worked it. Jake started spending more time near him. At first, he didn't say much, just leaned on the fence after chores, kicking at the dirt and avoiding eye contact. Scout never demanded his attention. He simply stood nearby, close enough to feel, but far enough to respect the silence. Over time, Jake started speaking in fragments, about school, about the noise at his mom's apartment, about how everything felt loud since the divorce except for this place. "I don't know why, but you make it quiet in my head," he mumbled one morning. Scout twitched his ear but didn't move. Jake smiled. "Yeah, I figured you'd get it." Inside the main pasture, Dusty continued to dominate. He herded the others with sharp stomps and glares, keeping order through presence alone. But even Dusty had started glancing toward the paddock more often, ears pricked, watching Scout like one might watch a hawk circling overhead, not afraid, but unwilling to turn away. Rosie, the gentle mare with old eyes, was the first to inch closer to the dividing fence, lingering just a few feet away when Scout was near. She didn't interact, but she didn't retreat either. Hank still grumbled about the extra feed, but even his tone had softened. "He's just standing there. All day. Doesn't eat much. Doesn't spook. It's like he's thinking about something." Martha, sipping coffee at the porch railing, replied, "Maybe he's waiting for permission." "Permission for what?" "To be what he already is." One afternoon, Jake decided to open the paddock gate, not out of rebellion, but instinct. Scout stepped forward cautiously, not bolting, not hesitating, as if he knew this day would come. Jake led him by a makeshift halter toward the open field, where the herd grazed lazily beneath the early autumn sun. Dusty lifted his head. The others followed. The moment Scout stepped over the invisible line that had separated them for days, the air tightened. No movement. No sound. Just a heavy, watching stillness. Scout didn't charge. He didn't yield. He walked with quiet dignity, head level, steps steady. He didn't challenge Dusty. He simply existed, unshaken, grounded, undeniable. And something in that silence unsettled the herd. From the barn, Hank watched it unfold and muttered, "He doesn't act like he wants to belong." Martha stood beside him, arms crossed. "No. He acts like he already does." It was late afternoon when the first signs of trouble appeared. A section of the old north fence, weakened by last week's windstorm, had given way. No one noticed at first. The herd had been grazing peacefully all day, and Hank had been focused on the tractor repairs. But Rosie began pacing, ears twitching, and Dusty let out a sharp, uneasy snort. Something was wrong, something Scout noticed before anyone else did. From his spot near the water trough, Scout froze, eyes locked on the distant tree line. Just beyond the broken fence, a coyote had slipped onto the property, thin, fast, and hungry. It crept low through the brush, aiming straight for a small, stray foal that had wandered near the gap in the fence. The other horses backed away instinctively, forming a loose wall, uncertain and disorganized. Scout moved. He broke into a quick, determined trot, cutting across the pasture with a speed and focus no one expected from legs so short. He didn't neigh or call for help. He simply placed himself between the foal and the predator. The coyote stopped, surprised, its yellow eyes narrowing. It let out a low growl, more out of confusion than threat. Scout didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward, stomping one hoof into the ground hard enough to send up a puff of dry dirt. His stance was unshaken, his body still. The coyote hesitated, just for a moment, before turning and darting back into the trees. The whole thing was over in less than 30 seconds. But it changed everything. Jake had seen it happen from the barn. He dropped the bucket of oats he'd been carrying and ran to Scout's side, heart pounding. The foal had returned safely to Rosie's side, trembling but unharmed. "You didn't even hesitate," Jake whispered, brushing the dust off Scout's side. "You knew exactly what to do." By the time Hank arrived, breathless, he didn't say a word. He just stared at the scene, the foal safe, the herd calm, and Scout standing still, like it had been just another part of his day. Later that evening, when Martha heard the story, she didn't ask for details. She just nodded once and said, "Of course he did." That night, as the herd gathered to sleep, Dusty walked closer to Scout than ever before. He didn't bow or yield, but he didn't chase him off either. And Rosie? She lay down beside Scout, the foal curled against her, eyes finally closed. From the porch, Martha watched the silhouette of that tiny horse under the fading sky, and her voice broke the silence like a prayer. "He's not big," she murmured, "but he's becoming something more than any of us expected." 3 days after the coyote incident, a white envelope appeared in the ranch's mailbox, buried between seed catalogs and an overdue electric bill. Martha opened it with little interest, until she saw the header. Larrabee Livestock Transport. The same company that had delivered Scout weeks ago. Her fingers tightened around the paper as she read the neatly typed lines. It was a polite apology, a formal explanation, and a request. The delivery error had been discovered. Scout was intended for a therapy program in El Paso. They'd be sending a trailer to retrieve him by the end of the week. Martha folded the letter slowly, her jaw clenched. It wasn't anger she felt, it was something heavier. Something tangled between guilt and heartbreak. She hadn't intended to keep Scout forever. Not at first. But now, the thought of that little creature being taken away felt like someone tearing out a page that hadn't finished writing itself. She placed the letter in the drawer beside the sink, shut it quietly, and said nothing to Hank or Jake. But Jake found it the next morning while looking for a pencil. His eyes scanned the page, and by the time he reached the last line, his hands were trembling. He stormed out of the house and found Martha near the barn. "They're taking him back?" he asked, voice cracking. Martha looked at the ground. "Jake, he doesn't belong to us. Not legally." "He does now," Jake snapped. "He belongs here. With me. With us." Scout, as always, was nearby. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the energy. He walked to Jake's side, nudging him gently with his muzzle. Jake knelt and hugged him, burying his face in Scout's neck. It wasn't just about the pony anymore. It was about everything Jake had started to rebuild. Losing Scout would feel like losing that progress all over again. That evening, Hank read the letter himself. They paid for him fair and square. "We can't just tell 'em no," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. Martha didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked to the paddock, where Scout now rested with Rosie and the young foal nearby. The other horses no longer avoided him. He was one of them. No, he was more. "He changed things here," she said softly. "He changed us. That's not something you just send away in a trailer." The next day, Martha made a decision. She wrote back to Larrabee Livestock with an offer. She would buy Scout, fair and proper. Not because of obligation, but because he had earned his place in ways no paperwork could ever prove. She wrote only one line in the memo: "He leads with silence, and we follow." The trailer arrived early on a Friday morning, just as the fog was beginning to lift off the pastures. Its engine rumbled low and steady, like it had no idea it was about to undo something sacred. Jake stood by the barn, fists clenched in his coat pockets, watching as the same faded green transport truck from weeks ago rolled to a stop near the main gate. Martha stood beside him, shoulders squared but quiet. Hank leaned against a fence post, arms crossed, pretending not to care, but his eyes never left Scout. Willard Larrabee, the driver, stepped out slowly, clipboard in hand. He was older than Jake remembered, weathered face, kind eyes, and boots that had walked through more miles of land than most people ever would. "Morning, folks," he said. "I'm here for the little one. Name's Scout, right?" Jake didn't answer. He just stared. Martha stepped forward. "We received your letter, and I sent a reply." Willard scratched the back of his neck. "Yeah, I got that. But the program down in El Paso still wants him. It's not up to me." Scout stood a few feet away, grazing beside Rosie and the young foal. The herd was calm, but alert, as if they knew something important was about to happen. When Willard approached with a halter in hand, Scout lifted his head and looked directly at him. Not fearful, just aware. Ready. As if he'd been expecting this moment and was already deciding how to handle it. Jake stepped between them. "He's not going anywhere." Willard paused. "Son, I understand how hard it is. But sometimes we have to give things up for the greater good." Jake's voice trembled. "He already is the greater good. He's helped more here than you'll ever understand. Not just the horses. Me. My grandma. Even Hank, though he won't admit it." Silence settled like dust between them. Then Martha reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. "This is a cashier's check. I'm buying him, properly. No more mistakes. No more transfers. He belongs here." Willard took the envelope, opened it, and nodded slowly. "That'll settle it. I'll file the paperwork. He's yours now." Jake exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. Scout stepped forward, gently bumping Jake's arm with his nose, as if to say, "I knew you'd come through." As the trailer pulled away, empty, Hank finally broke his silence. "Can't believe we just paid money for the smallest horse west of the Mississippi." Martha smiled without looking at him. "He may be small, but he's the biggest thing to happen to this ranch in years." Scout walked past them, head high, tail swaying gently behind him. And none of the herd moved until he did. After the trailer disappeared down the long gravel road, the ranch felt different, not louder or busier, but warmer somehow. The tension that had hung in the air for weeks had finally broken, replaced by something close to peace. Scout didn't celebrate. He didn't prance or show off. Instead, he went back to grazing beside Rosie and the foal, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Jake noticed it first. The way Dusty no longer stared at Scout like a threat. The way the herd moved when Scout moved, how they seemed to mirror his stillness, his caution, his confidence. The once mocked little horse had become the silent rhythm of the field. Jake stood at the edge of the pasture each evening now, sometimes with a book, sometimes with nothing but thoughts. Scout always came close, never begging for attention, but never far. Inside the house, Martha had returned to her early morning routine. Black coffee, sunrise, and a long look across the land from the front porch. Scout was always the first thing she spotted, not because of his size, but because of his presence. He had a way of drawing the eye, not through movement, but through meaning. She often caught herself smiling before realizing it, and when she did, she whispered, "John would have liked him." One crisp afternoon, the school from town brought a small group of children to visit the ranch, part of a fall field trip. Jake was hesitant at first, unsure how Scout would react to loud, unfamiliar energy. But the pony surprised him yet again. He didn't back away from the crowd of small hands. He didn't flinch when one child tripped and fell beside him. He stood calm and steady, letting them brush his coat, touch his nose, giggle against his side. The ranch had seen bigger horses, flashier ones, but none had ever done that. Emily, the town vet, came by later that day. After checking on the older horses, she knelt beside Scout and gave him a soft pat. "You've become something special here, haven't you?" she said. "Not many animals change people. But somehow you did." She looked over her shoulder at Jake, who was helping a little girl onto Dusty's back. "And not just people, generations." That night, as stars filled the sky, Scout rested beneath the old sycamore near the barn, Rosie beside him, the foal curled close. Jake sat nearby on a hay bale, writing in his notebook. His pen paused for a long moment before he scribbled. He didn't have to fight to belong. He just waited until we saw what was already true. Jake closed the book and looked out over the pasture. He knew now. Scout hadn't come to the ranch by mistake. He had come because something here needed healing. And somehow, without a word, he had delivered it. The first snow came early that year. Thin flurries danced through the sky, melting the moment they touched the ground, but it was enough to remind everyone at Broken Horn Ranch that winter was coming fast. With it came heavier work, prepping the barn, insulating the water lines, and checking the older animals for signs of cold stress. Scout, now fully accepted into the herd, moved with purpose. He wasn't fast, and he wasn't flashy, but his presence had become a kind of quiet leadership the others naturally followed. Dusty, once skeptical, now grazed shoulder to shoulder with Scout as if they'd known each other for years. Rosie, as always, stayed close, her foal now growing stronger and bolder with each passing day. Hank even admitted, though only to Martha, that he didn't mind seeing the little guy first thing each morning. "Something about him just makes the place feel settled," he said, scratching his beard. Martha nodded. "Some animals bring work. Some bring warmth. Scout brought both. But not everyone was at ease. One of the new ranch hands, a tall young man named Chet with more muscle than experience, had joined the team for the winter. Raised in rodeos and full of loud opinions, he scoffed at the idea of Scout being anything more than a novelty. "That ain't a horse," he laughed one morning. "That's a lawn ornament with hooves." Jake overheard the comment but didn't respond. He'd learned something Scout had already mastered. Not every insult needs an answer. A few days later, during a routine roundup near the southern pasture, one of the older Mares panicked after stepping in a frozen puddle and fell awkwardly, twisting her leg. Chaos followed. Horses scattered, Chet shouted instructions no one could follow, and the herd began to splinter in confusion. But then, from the far end of the field, Scout appeared. He moved between the frightened horses, not rushing, not pushing. He made eye contact with Dusty, then circled the injured mare slowly. The energy shifted. Rosie nudged her foal behind Scout. Dusty calmed. One by one, the herd stopped running. Even Chet fell silent as the field returned to stillness. Later, when the vet arrived, she found the mare stable and the herd calm. "Whoever got them settled," she said, "knows more about horses than half the men I've worked with." Jake just smiled and pointed toward Scout, now trotting quietly back to the barn. He did it. That evening, Chet approached Jake by the fence. He nodded toward Scout and muttered, "Didn't expect that." Jake shrugged. "No one does at first." And as Scout disappeared into the barn shadows, tail swaying gently behind him, it became clearer than ever. He didn't need to prove his worth. He simply lived it, day by day. The snow came heavier by mid-December, blanketing Broken Horn Ranch in soft white quiet. The fields no longer echoed with hooves but held a hush, like the land itself was listening. Inside the barn, the horses had settled into their winter rhythm, less roaming, more resting. And in the center of it all was Scout. He didn't push. He didn't lead with noise. He simply moved with intention, and somehow the others followed. Jake had started keeping a journal that winter. In it, he wrote observations about the herd, his chores, and, most often, Scout. "Leadership doesn't always look like power," he wrote one night. "Sometimes it just looks like patience, like stillness, like Scout." He read the entries aloud to Martha on quiet evenings, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, her eyes misty as she listened. "You're learning more from that little horse than most men learn in a lifetime," she said softly. Jake nodded. "He teaches without trying." Hank, now fully softened to the pony's presence, had even started referring to him as "boss" on occasion. Not in jest, but with quiet respect. "Somehow, every horse in that barn listens to him before they listen to me," he admitted one morning. Martha smirked. "You just figured that out?" Even the town had begun to notice. Visitors passing through for winter firewood or hay pickups would ask, "Is the little horse still here?" And Martha would always answer with pride, "He never left." But time, as it always does, kept moving. Scout's steps became a little slower. His coat, once bright and clean, showed flecks of gray around his muzzle. He still stood proud, still watched the herd like a shepherd, but the energy behind his eyes had softened. Jake noticed first. The way Scout now lingered longer in the sunlight. The way he stood a bit more often than he lay down. Still alert. Still Scout. But older. One late afternoon, as golden light poured through the cracks in the barn, Jake found Scout resting near the stall where he had first been placed months ago. The other horses were nearby, as if drawn to him by instinct. Jake knelt beside him, brushing his coat slowly, speaking no words, because none were needed. Scout blinked slowly, then closed his eyes again, resting without fear. It wasn't sickness. It wasn't pain. It was peace. From the porch, Martha watched the scene unfold. Jake, Scout, the quiet herd. She took a deep breath and wrapped the quilt tighter around her shoulders. "He's not leaving," she whispered to the wind. "He's becoming part of the land." And under the fading orange sky, Scout slept soundly, his herd close, his purpose complete. Spring returned quietly to Broken Horn Ranch. The snow melted in slow drips from the barn roof, and green began to creep back across the fields. Birds filled the trees again, and calves took their first wobbly steps in the pastures. Life, as it always did, moved forward. But it moved differently now, slower in some places, gentler in others. Because Scout was no longer walking among them. He had passed peacefully weeks before, under a sky full of stars, with Jake at his side and the herd standing vigil until the very end. They buried him beneath the old sycamore tree, the one he used to rest beneath on warm afternoons. Martha chose the spot herself. Jake built the marker by hand, a smooth wooden cross with a brass plate that simply read, "Scout, Heart of the Ranch." No dates. No fancy words. Because none were needed. Anyone who had met Scout already carried the rest of the story in their chest. Jake still came to the tree every morning before chores. Sometimes he'd sit beside the marker in silence. Other times, he'd read aloud from his journal, the pages now filled with reflections, memories, and lessons he didn't even realize he was learning until Scout taught them. "You were never loud," he whispered once. "But you never had to be. Everyone just listened anyway." Martha felt it too. She caught herself glancing toward the pasture out of habit, expecting to see that familiar little shape standing near the fence, watching. And sometimes, just for a moment, she swore she did see him, there in the corner of her eye, standing tall in spirit if not in body. It wasn't sadness she felt any more. It was something deeper. Gratitude. Because not every ranch gets a legend. And not every legend walks on 4 small hooves. Even Hank changed. He never said much, but he started being more patient with the younger animals. More thoughtful. He stopped raising his voice so quickly. Once, while helping a nervous new colt find his footing, he muttered, "Come on, little fella." Scout would have waited longer. He didn't think anyone heard it. But Jake did. And he smiled. As the months passed, people from town began stopping by just to visit the tree. Some brought apples. Some just stood in silence. Others sat in the grass and told stories about a small horse who led without force, who healed without words, and who belonged not because someone said he could, but because he showed he did. And so the ranch moved on. The grass grew, the fences aged, and the sky changed colors like always. But something in the soil was different now. Deeper. Wiser. Because long after Scout was gone, his way of leading, quiet, steady, unshakable, remained in every corner of Broken Horn Ranch.